Ethan Cole slammed his fist into the bathroom wall so hard, the mirror shook. The tie, the last tie his dead wife ever touched, hung from his fingers in a crumpled wreck, and he was 40 minutes away from the most important interview of his life, and his hands would not stop trembling. He pressed his forehead against the cold tile and made himself breathe. Then he picked the tie back up, knotted it wrong, for the 5th time, walked into that building anyway, and in a glass elevator on the 38th floor, the CEO of Lane Enterprises reached out without a single word, fixed the knot herself, and then leaned close enough that he felt her breath and whispered something that changed everything. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit subscribe. You don't want to miss what comes next. The morning Ethan Cole decided to fight for his life again, he burned his daughter's toast and punched a wall before 8 a.m. Not a hard punch, not the kind that breaks knuckles or leaves holes in drywall. Just the flat, frustrated slam of a man who had held it together for 2 years straight and was feeling the seams start to pull. The bathroom wall absorbed it. The mirror rattled once, and then the apartment went quiet again, except for the smoke alarm screaming from the kitchen and Maya's voice floating down the hall. "Dad, something's burning." "I know." He turned off the faucet he'd forgotten he left running. "I've got it." "It smells really bad." "Maya." "Like really, really?" "I've got it." He walked back into the kitchen, pulled the black toast from the toaster, dropped it in the sink, grabbed the dish towel and waved it at the smoke detector until it stopped. Then he stood there in his dress pants and his undershirt towel in hand and stared at the ruined bread like it had personally wronged him. Maya appeared in the kitchen doorway. 7 years old, yellow sweater hair, half-brushed, studying him with those enormous dark eyes that saw everything and forgave most of it. "You're nervous," she said. "I'm fine." "Your eye is doing that twitchy thing." "It's not." He touched the corner of his eye. It was in fact twitching. He dropped his hand. "I'm fine, Maya." She walked to the pantry without another word, came back with a granola bar, and set it on the counter in front of him. Chocolate chip. His favorite, which she knew because she paid attention to things like that, the way Claire had always paid attention to things like that, and sometimes the similarity hit him so hard and so fast that it took everything he had not to let it show on his face. "Breakfast," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, baby." "You practiced all week." She climbed up onto the kitchen stool, propped her chin in both hands, and looked at him with complete, unshakable certainty. "You're going to get the job." "You don't know that." "I know you," she said. "Same thing." He opened his mouth, closed it, and decided that arguing with a 7-year-old's faith in him at 7:40 in the morning was not a fight he needed to pick. He took a bite of the granola bar. "Go finish your hair. Mrs. Patterson's coming at 8:30. She slid off the stool, and then she stopped in the doorway and looked back at him over her shoulder. And for just a half second, the morning light caught her profile in a way that made his chest seize up completely. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Mom would say good luck too." She said it quietly. Not sadly, just honestly, the way kids say true things straight and clean, and with no armor around them. "I thought you should know." She disappeared down the hall. Ethan stood in his kitchen for a long moment. Then he finished the granola bar, set the wrapper down, and went back to the bathroom to deal with the tie. It was the knot that was killing him. He'd tried it 4 times before the wall incident. He tried it a 5th time after working the silk carefully between his fingers, watching his own hands in the mirror, like they belonged to someone he didn't entirely trust. The tie had been Claire's last anniversary gift to him. October 3 years ago, a quiet breakfast. Maya still asleep, Claire sliding a small box across the table with that particular smile of hers, the one that lit her up from somewhere behind her eyes. She'd said, "Every man worth trusting knows how to wear a good tie, Ethan." He'd laughed. She'd reached over and tied it for him right there at the table, fingers, certain and quick, and then she'd patted it flat against his chest and said, "There, Now you look like someone worth keeping." 6 months later, she was gone. A blood clot. A Tuesday afternoon. No warning and no second chance. He stared at the knot in the mirror. Still wrong. Sitting off to the left, thick where it should taper, the whole thing slightly defeated looking, like it knew. "Come on," he said quietly. He undid it. Started over. His hands were trembling, not violently, just that low, persistent vibration that came from 3 days of almost no sleep. Too much coffee, and the specific suffocating anxiety of knowing that everything was riding on the next 3 hours. He'd spent those 3 days doing nothing but preparing. He had Victoria Lane's investor letters practically memorized. He'd rebuilt the Hartwell analysis from scratch twice just to make sure the logic was airtight. He knew Lane Enterprises' portfolio structure, their acquisition history, their Q3 and Q4 numbers, their stated growth targets for the next 18 months. He was ready. He knew he was ready. And yet his hands would not stop shaking over a tie. He knotted it again. Looked in the mirror. Still crooked. He pressed both palms flat on the edge of the sink. Breathed. Looked at himself, the gray suit, the pressed shirt, the dark circles. He'd done his best to minimize the faint threads of silver at his temples that hadn't been there before Claire died. 41 years old. 2-year gap in his resume. Single father. Applying for a senior analyst position at one of the most competitive financial firms in Chicago, walking in without the kind of clean, uninterrupted career arc that companies like Lane Enterprises typically demanded. "I just need today," he said to the mirror, low, almost under his breath. He didn't entirely know who he was talking to. Maybe nobody. Maybe her. "One day. Just let me get through today." He picked up the tie, knotted it a 6th time. It was still slightly crooked. He left it. He was out of time. Lane Enterprises was on Michigan Avenue in a glass tower that had always seemed to Ethan like a building that belonged to the city, the way a landmark belongs to a city permanently, inevitably, as if it had simply always been there and always would be. He'd walked past it hundreds of times over the years without ever imagining himself going in. He pushed through the revolving door at 8:47. The lobby was marble and quiet, the kind of quiet that had money in it. He crossed to the reception desk and gave his name to the young man behind it, wireframe glasses, headset, the pleasant efficiency of someone who'd been trained to make visitors feel processed without feeling processed. "Mr. Cole, of course. Please have a seat. I'll let Miss Lane's assistant know you've arrived." Ethan sat down in a chair near the windows and looked at his watch. 8:48, 11 minutes early. He straightened his tie, still crooked. He thought about pulling out his phone, running through his notes one final time. But he'd reviewed them so many times, the words had decomposed into individual letters, meaningless and separate. He knew what he'd prepared. He either had it or he didn't. He sat with that thought, and it wasn't comfortable, but he sat with it. "Mr. Cole." He stood. A woman in her 30s, blazer tablet, the focused calm of someone who managed a difficult person's schedule and had made peace with that fact. "I'm Diane, Ms. Lane's executive assistant. She's ready for you." He buttoned his jacket and followed her. The elevator was fast and silent. 41 seconds to the 38th floor. Ethan counted because counting gave his mind something to do other than rehearse catastrophic scenarios. Diane led him down a corridor. Quiet. Purposeful. The kind of hallway that communicated without saying anything that the people who worked here did not waste time. At the end of it was a set of frosted glass doors, and Diane stopped just before them and turned to him. "She's finishing a call." "One moment." He nodded. He stood in the corridor and breathed. In through the nose, slow out through the mouth. He'd learned that from a therapist in the first year after Claire. You don't control everything, Ethan. You only control your breath. So start there. He heard the voice through the doors. Lower than he'd expected. Composed, precise, each word placed where it was meant to go and nowhere else. "Tell Marcus the revised model needs to be on my desk by Thursday. Not Friday. Thursday. A pause. I understand he has concerns. That's why we have a Thursday deadline instead of a Wednesday one. He should consider that a courtesy. Another pause, shorter. Thank you, Diane. The frosted doors opened. Victoria Lane walked into the hallway. She was taller than her photographs. Or maybe it was the way she held herself straight-backed, unhurried, the particular posture of someone who had walked into enough rooms that she'd stopped thinking about it. Dark blazer, white blouse, dark hair pulled back. Somewhere in her mid-40s. She carried it with the easy confidence of a woman who'd spent a long time being the smartest person in any given room and had grown entirely comfortable with that fact. She glanced at Diane first. The automatic efficient check, and then she looked at Ethan. He was already looking at her. He couldn't not look at her. There was something in her presence that pulled attention the way gravity pulled objects. Not dramatic, just inevitable. Mr. Cole, she extended her hand. Ms. Lane. He shook it. Firm grip. Eye contact. Good. He'd practiced those. And then her eyes moved just slightly, just fractionally, with the involuntary precision of someone whose attention to detail was simply always running, and she looked at his tie. He saw it happen. He braced. He was about to say something, some preemptive acknowledgement, some small self-deprecating comment to get ahead of it. She stepped forward. No warning, no question. She simply closed the distance between them, close enough that he caught the scent of something clean and understated, and her hands came up to his collar. Fingers, finding the knot with a calm, unhurried certainty. Like she'd done this 1,000 times and found it completely unremarkable. Ethan stopped breathing. Not from discomfort, not even entirely from surprise. From the shock of proximity, the simple physical fact of someone being this close to him. Nobody had been this close in a long time. Nobody had touched him like this with this quiet easiness since Claire. Since before everything changed. Victoria's fingers worked the silk quickly. 2 adjustments, maybe 3. She centered the knot, smoothed the tie flat against his chest with one firm, brief press of her palm, and stepped back. She looked at it. Gave a small single nod. There, she said. Ethan stood very still. He hoped the expression on his face was something close to composed. He was not entirely sure it was. Thank you, he managed. I noticed details. She turned toward the open office doors and gestured. Come in, Mr. Cole. She didn't sit behind her desk. She led him to the sitting area, 2 chairs angled across from each other, a glass table between them, and she sat down and crossed one leg over the other and looked at him with the focused, steady attention of someone who evaluated people for a living and was very good at it. He sat, clasped his hands in his lap, made himself unclench them. You know why you're here, she said. No warm-up, no small talk, not a question. The senior analyst position, cross-sector. I know what the position is. A slight tilt of her head. I'm asking if you know why you are here. Why your file landed on my desk out of 63 applicants with significantly cleaner employment records. Ethan paused. I didn't know the number was 63. Now you do. Her expression didn't change. Take a guess. He looked at her. She was holding the silence with total comfort, watching him the way someone watches a problem they're genuinely curious about. The Hartwell analysis, he said. The one I submitted with my application. My projection contradicted the market consensus by 14%, and it was correct. Something moved in her face, small, controlled, but there. It was correct, she said. Hartwell announced the restructuring 22 days after you submitted that document, at a time when nearly every analyst in this city was still rating it a strong hold. She opened the folder on the table between them, his file without looking down at it. You spent 8 years at Mercer Financial. Senior analyst by year 4, strong internal reviews, a trajectory that by any reasonable measure was leading somewhere significant. She paused. And then you walked away. I did. Why? My wife died. He said it directly without cushioning it. I had a 5-year-old daughter and no one else, so I left. Victoria looked at him. She didn't flinch, didn't recalibrate, didn't give him the slightly pained, slightly uncomfortable expression that most people produced when a dead spouse entered a professional conversation before 9 in the morning. She just looked at him steadily, like the information had been received and filed, and she was ready to continue. In the 2 years since, she said, your consulting work was limited. 3 clients. 3 clients. Modest-looking contracts. He leaned forward slightly. You've seen the outcome data on all 3. I've seen it. Then you know what the work actually was. She held his gaze. Tell me what you think it was. Independent analysis without institutional bias, without a firm's existing positions shaping my conclusions before I started, without a managing director's quarterly bonus affecting which risks I flagged and which ones I buried. He paused. The Hartwell call came out of that period. So did 2 other projections that I didn't submit with my application because I didn't want to look like I was overselling. I can give you those numbers today if you want them. She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone thinking of what to say next. The silence of someone who was listening more carefully than they were letting on. What did you do? She said, when you weren't working. I raised my daughter. Full-time. Full-time. And you believe that's professionally relevant. I believe it's personally relevant, which made me better professionally. He said it without apology and without aggression. Just the plain settled truth of something he'd had 2 years to understand completely. I had time to think. Real thinking, not reactive, not deadline-driven, not shaped by what the person in the office next to mine believed. I read more carefully and analyzed more independently than I ever had inside a firm. That's not a gap in my record. That's the reason the Hartwell analysis exists. She picked up the folder, held it without opening it, looked at him. Walk me through the Hartwell analysis, she said. Beginning to end. Your reasoning, not the conclusion. He walked her through it. And somewhere in the first 2 or 3 minutes, the trembling in his hands stopped. Not gradually, just gone like a switch flipped, because this was the work. This was the actual, real, substantive thing, and he knew it cold, and he'd always known how to do this. The anxiety lived in the preparation and the waiting. The moment it started, it disappeared. He talked. Victoria listened and questioned sharp surgical questions, the kind that weren't testing whether he knew the material, but whether he truly understood its architecture. She pushed at the edges of his reasoning, came at it from angles, presented alternative interpretations, and waited to see whether he'd defend his position or collapse it. He defended it. When she was right, he acknowledged it immediately and adjusted in real time. When she was wrong, and she was wrong once on the interest rate sensitivity assumption, he said so clearly, and without softening it. She looked at him when he pushed back. Explain, she said. He explained. She held the disagreement for a moment. Then she nodded once. You're right. I know, he said. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more controlled and more interesting than a smile. They talked for 30 minutes, then 40. Ethan stopped being nervous around minute 15 and stopped thinking about the interview around minute 25. He was just thinking and talking and following the logic wherever it went, the way he used to in the early years at Mercer, before the politics settled over everything like sediment. He looked at her while he was making a point about counter-cyclical positioning in a contracting credit environment. Looked at her face the way you look at the face of the person you're talking to, the ordinary automatic act of it, and his eyes landed on her mouth for a half-second before he pulled them back. He kept talking. 2 minutes later, it happened again. He was mid-sentence, something about duration risk in long-dated instruments, and he glanced at her lips and caught himself and returned to her eyes. He kept going. He finished the point. It was a good point. The third time, he was in the middle of a complete, well-constructed sentence about asymmetric risk exposure in emerging markets, a sentence that deserved to be finished, and he glanced at her mouth just for a moment. Just that involuntary half-second. And when his eyes came back up to hers, she was already watching him. Not with irritation, not with discomfort, with something quieter and considerably more precise than either. She let the silence hold for exactly 3 seconds. Then she leaned forward just slightly, a deliberate shift in her posture, and her voice dropped just enough. "Mr. Cole." "Yes." "You've glanced at my lips 3 times in the last 5 minutes." The room went completely still. The heat moved through his face fast. He started to form the professional response, the composed, appropriate, calibrated response, and it dissolved before it reached his mouth, and what came out was simply the truth. "I'm aware of that. I apologize." She didn't lean back. She held the angle, and her eyes stayed on his, and her voice was perfectly level when she said quietly, deliberately, with the same precision she applied to everything else, "If you can't stop staring at my lips, Mr. Cole, I'll have to do something about it." He did not breathe. She held his gaze for one full, unhurried second, long enough for the words to settle completely into his chest. Long enough that there was no possible way to pretend they hadn't landed exactly where they were aimed. And then she leaned back in her chair, opened the folder in her lap, and said in a tone of complete, seamless professionalism, "Now, walk me through your framework for stress testing a portfolio under asymmetric risk conditions." Ethan Cole sat in that chair 40 stories above Michigan Avenue, with his heart running hard, and his mind processing 3 simultaneous interpretations of what had just happened. And he did the only reasonable thing available to him. He answered the question. But for every remaining minute of that interview, through every number, every analysis, every careful and composed professional exchange, he did not look at her lips again. He looked at her eyes. And every single time, without exception, she was already looking back. The interview ended at 10:14. Ethan knew the exact time because he checked his watch. When Victoria stood up, and the checking was involuntary, the reflex of a man trying to anchor himself to something concrete and measurable after 90 minutes of a conversation that had felt increasingly like standing on ground that shifted slightly every time he thought he'd found his footing. She walked him to the door herself. Not Diane, Victoria. She pulled the frosted glass panel open and held it, and as he stepped through, she said, "You'll hear from us within the week, Mr. Cole." In the same level professional tone she'd used for the last 20 minutes of the interview, the tone that gave away nothing that had presumably been calibrated over years of making sure people left her office without being able to read her. "Thank you for your time," he said. "Thank you for yours." She looked at him for a half-second longer than a purely professional goodbye required. Then she let the door swing shut. He stood in the corridor alone. Diane was at her desk 20 feet away, typing, and she gave him a brief, practiced smile and gestured toward the elevator. He walked to it, pressed the button, waited. The whole time he was aware with the particular clarity of a man who had just been through something he didn't have a category for, that his heart rate had not yet returned to normal. The elevator came. He stepped in. The doors closed. He was alone in it. He exhaled slowly, leaned back against the wall, and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent light above him hummed softly. The car descended. "If you can't stop staring at my lips, Mr. Cole, I'll have to do something about it." He heard it again perfectly. The exact drop in her register, the precise, deliberate weight of each word. He'd replayed it 4 or 5 times already in the last 20 minutes, sitting across from her, trying to finish answers to serious analytical questions, while that sentence lived in the back of his skull like a lit match. He still didn't know what it meant. That was the part that was eating at him, not the words themselves, but the ambiguity of them. She was a woman who chose words with the same intentionality she apparently applied to everything else. Nothing she'd said in 90 minutes had been careless or accidental. So the question wasn't whether she'd meant it. The question was, which version of meaning she'd intended, and he had two options that were so completely different from each other that choosing wrong felt dangerous in a way he couldn't entirely articulate. Option 1, she was testing him, measuring how he handled unexpected pressure disruption, the intrusion of something personal into a professional space. Seeing whether he'd fold over correct, get flustered enough to fall apart in the final third of the interview. In that version, the line was a tool, a calculated one. Option 2, and this was the version he kept returning to, and then pulling himself back from, was that it wasn't a test at all. The elevator opened into the lobby. He walked out into the marble and quiet nodded at the receptionist without stopping, and pushed through the revolving door into the November air. It hit him hard, cold and sharp, the particular edge of Chicago in late fall, the kind of cold that doesn't negotiate. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his coat pockets. Michigan Avenue, moving around him in all directions. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out. "Mrs. Patterson." "How'd it go?" Maya keeps asking. "She made me text you." He smiled despite himself. He typed back, "Tell her I didn't embarrass myself. Mostly." 3 seconds later, she says that's not good enough and you need to call her at lunch. He put his phone away and started walking toward the parking garage 2 blocks north, and he tried to think about the analytical questions Victoria had asked him, rather than the one thing she'd said that he couldn't stop turning over in his hands. He tried to reconstruct the interview as a professional exercise, where he'd been strong, where he could have been sharper, whether the pushback on the interest rate assumption had landed as confident or as combative. The professional reconstruction lasted approximately 1 block. Then he was back to the way she'd looked at him when she said it. The way she'd leaned forward just slightly. The fact that she hadn't smiled, hadn't softened it into a joke, or walked it back with a laugh, or given him any social signal that would have allowed him to file it neatly under professional banter and move on. She'd just said it, and then she'd waited, and then she'd continued the interview as if the air in the room hadn't changed at all. He reached the parking garage, took the stairs to level 2, found his car, and sat in it for a full minute before starting the engine. He thought about Claire. He thought about her specifically in the way he thought about her when something happened that he would have told her about, not the grief version, not the loss-shaped hole version, but the involuntary, habitual version. The version where his first instinct was still, after 3 years, to pick up the phone and say, "You are not going to believe what just happened to me today." The version that arrived before he could stop it and left a particular ache behind when it passed. He started the car. He had to pick up dry cleaning and buy groceries and be home before Maya got back at 3:15 and figure out what to make for dinner. And none of that had changed because of what had happened this morning. His life had the same dimensions and the same weight it had had at 8 a.m. The interview was over. The outcome was unknown, and he had the rest of the day to fill. He pulled out of the garage and into traffic and tried more or less successfully not to think about Victoria Lane. He failed more or less completely. 3 days passed. He kept busy because keeping busy was the only strategy he'd ever found that actually worked. He took Maya to her Thursday afternoon piano lesson and sat in the waiting area reading a report on European fixed-income markets. He did a full reanalysis of a mid-cap industrial he'd been watching for 6 months, just to stay sharp. He called his older brother in Cincinnati, David, who asked how the interview went, and then immediately pivoted to asking whether Ethan was getting out more, which was David's long-standing, barely coded way of asking whether Ethan had started dating again. "That's not really where my head is right now," Ethan said. "It's been 2 years, man." "I know how long it's been." "I'm not saying forget her. I'm saying..." "I know what you're saying, David." A pause. "How'd the interview actually go?" Ethan thought about it. "Strange," he said. "It went strange." "Strange good or strange bad?" "I genuinely don't know." David let that sit for a second. "You going to tell me what that means?" "No." "Okay." Another pause. "She pretty?" "Goodbye, David." He hung up and sat in his kitchen with his coffee cooling in front of him, and his brother's question still in the room. He didn't answer it out loud, not even to himself. But he was aware with the low-frequency awareness of a man who had been honest with himself for long enough that he'd stopped being able to get away with not being honest, that the answer was not the relevant part of the question. The relevant part was that he'd noticed that after 2 years of existing in the world in a way that was entirely functional and entirely closed, not damaged, not broken, just closed, the way a hand closes around something, it's protecting something, had moved. Something small. But something. He didn't know what to do with that. On the 4th day, his phone rang at 9 in the morning. He was at the kitchen table with Maya's cereal bowl still in the drying rack and a half-finished cup of coffee at his elbow and his laptop open to a position paper he'd been annotating. The number on the screen was a Chicago area code he didn't recognize. He answered on the second ring. Ethan Cole. Mr. Cole. The voice was Diane's, that same focused, pleasant efficiency. This is Diane Marsh, Ms. Lane's executive assistant. Do you have a moment? He closed the laptop. Yes. Ms. Lane would like to schedule a follow-up conversation. She has availability tomorrow at 2 p.m. or Thursday at 10. Would either of those work for you? A follow-up. Not a rejection call. Rejection calls didn't come from the CEO's executive assistant, and they didn't offer 2 scheduling options. He made himself not read too much into that, and then he made himself acknowledge that he was absolutely reading something into it. Tomorrow at 2 works, he said. Is this in person or in person? Yes. Same location. I'll be there. Wonderful. I'll send a confirmation to your email. Have a good morning, Mr. Cole. The call ended. He set the phone down on the table. He looked at the half-finished coffee. He looked at the closed laptop. He looked at the drying rack and Maya's cereal bowl with the cartoon dog on the side that she'd picked out herself at Target 4 months ago and still treated as non-negotiable breakfast equipment. Then he picked his phone back up and called David. David answered on the 3rd ring. Twice in 1 week. Either something good happened or something terrible. They want a follow-up meeting. A beat. The Lane job. Yeah. Ethan. David's voice shifted into the register it used for things he actually meant underneath all the older brother ribbing. That's a big deal. I know. You ready? He thought about the frosted glass doors and the corridor and Victoria Lane's hands at his collar and her voice dropping half a register and 12 words that had been living in his head for 4 days without paying rent. Working on it, he said. He wore a different tie the next day. He'd made that decision deliberately, and he'd made it early, and he wasn't entirely proud of how much internal negotiation it had required. The silk one, Claire's tie, the crooked one, he'd folded it carefully and put it back in the drawer that morning, and he'd stood there looking at it for a moment before he closed the drawer, and what he'd said in his head was, I'm not putting you away. I'm just doing this one on my own. He didn't know if that was progress or just a story he was telling himself. He tied the new tie without a problem, which felt significant, and then felt like too much weight to put on a piece of neckwear, and he was in the lobby of Lane Enterprises at 1:53. Diane came for him at 1:58. She's ready, Diane said, and the 2 words carried no information about what ready meant or what was coming, and Ethan followed her down the same corridor, toward the same frosted glass doors, and reminded himself that he was a 41-year-old man with a decade of serious analytical work behind him, and not someone who should be experiencing this particular quality of anticipation over a job interview follow-up. The door was already open. Victoria was standing at the window. Not sitting, not at her desk, standing looking out at the city with her arms loosely crossed, and she turned when he entered and looked at him the same way she always seemed to look at him, directly, completely, without the usual social preamble. Mr. Cole. She gestured toward the chairs. Sit down. He sat. She remained standing for a moment, still at the window, and then she moved to her chair and sat down and opened the folder on the table. The same folder, his file, which was starting to feel like a recurring character in his life. I wanted to speak with you again before making a decision, she said. I understand. There are things I can assess on paper. Technical ability, analytical track record pattern recognition. The kind of judgment that shows up in a Hartwell call, 14% outside consensus. She set the folder down. There are things I can only assess in a room. Such as? She looked at him. How a person handles being destabilized. He held her gaze. You mean the interview? I mean the interview. She paused. You didn't fall apart. You also didn't pretend it hadn't happened, which would have been worse. You sat with it, finished your answers, and maintained the quality of your thinking under conditions that were... She tilted her head slightly, deliberately unusual. He waited. I want to know, she said, whether that steadiness is consistent, or whether it was a performance. With respect, he said, that's not a question I can answer. You'd have to watch me work. That's exactly what I'm proposing. She leaned back. The position we discussed isn't the only opening I have. There's a second role, a smaller team, closer access to the firm's core strategic decisions, considerably more pressure, and considerably more visibility. The candidate I put in that role needs to be someone whose judgment I trust completely, whose performance doesn't degrade when the environment gets difficult, and who is honest with me even when honesty is inconvenient. Something shifted in his chest. You're offering me a different position than the one I applied for. I'm considering it. She looked at him steadily. I'm considering it because of three things. The Hartwell analysis, the way you handled the pushback on the interest rate assumption you told me I was wrong, which most candidates in that chair would never do. And the fact that when I asked about the 2 years you spent at home with your daughter, you didn't apologize for it. Most people apologize for the things they actually need to stand behind. He was quiet for a moment. What would the role require? He said. I'll need you directly available to me on strategic decisions. That means hours that aren't always predictable. It means access to information that requires absolute discretion. It means working closely with me, which, and here, something in her delivery shifted just slightly, a half step from pure professional neutral. Some people find difficult. Because you're demanding. Because I'm direct. People confuse the two. She paused. You'd need to be able to handle that. I think, Ethan said, you'd need to be able to handle someone who pushes back when they think you're wrong. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, yes, I would. The answer was simple and direct and completely without defensiveness, and it surprised him, not because it was unexpected from a woman who seemed to value directness above almost everything, but because of the way she said it. Like it was a concession. Like it cost her something small, and she'd decided it was worth paying. Tell me about your daughter, she said. He blinked. The shift was fast. Maya. You mentioned her in the first interview. You said prioritizing her well-being over your career was something you'd do again. I would. What happens to her when your hours become unpredictable? I have a system, he said. Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor. She's retired. She's been helping since Claire died. My brother is 2 hours away and works remotely. I've been managing a 7-year-old's schedule and my own professional obligations simultaneously for 2 years. I'm not going to pretend it's always easy. But the question isn't whether it's easy. It's whether I can do it. He paused. I can do it. She nodded once. Then she said, she sounds like a remarkable kid. He looked at her. The words were quiet, and they landed differently than everything else she'd said, not professionally, not as part of an assessment, just as a human thing, said plainly. She is, he said. She's the most remarkable person I know. Something happened in Victoria's face. Brief, controlled, but real. She looked down at the folder and then back up at him, and when she spoke, her voice was entirely professional again, but the brief moment of something else had been there, and they both knew it. I'll have a formal offer to you by Friday, she said. I'd like you to review it carefully and come back to me with any questions. I don't want you to accept it without understanding exactly what you're walking into. I appreciate that. I mean it as a warning, not a courtesy. She held his gaze. This firm runs hard. I run harder. You'll be working directly with me on decisions that matter under pressure, that's real, and there won't be a gradual on-ramp. You'll be in the water on day one. I've been in cold water before, he said. I know. She looked at him. That's why we're having this conversation. She stood up. He stood up. They were on the same side of the glass table now, closer than the chairs had put them, and she extended her hand. He shook it. And the handshake lasted exactly 1 second longer than it needed to. Not dramatically, not obviously, just 1 second longer. Her grip didn't tighten his, didn't either, but neither of them let go at the moment they should have, and then they did, and Victoria Lane stepped back with her customary composure perfectly in place and said, "Friday, Mr. Cole, watch for the email." He walked out of the office, down the corridor, into the elevator, and out through the marble lobby onto Michigan Avenue. The cold hit him again. He stood on the sidewalk and didn't move for a moment. The handshake had lasted 1 second longer than it needed to. He was absolutely certain that was not an accident. He started walking toward his car, and for the first time in 4 days, the 12 words that had been living rent-free in his head were joined by something else. Not an answer, not a resolution. Just the quiet, unsettling, not entirely unwelcome understanding that whatever was happening between him and Victoria Lane had not ended in that interview room. It had, in some way, he couldn't yet measure or map, only just begun. And he was not nearly as afraid of that as he probably should have been. The offer arrived on Friday at 4:47 p.m. Ethan was in the middle of helping Maya with her multiplication tables when his phone lit up on the kitchen counter with an email notification from Diane.Marsh@laneenterprises.com. And he made himself finish the sevens before he picked it up. That was a decision. A small, deliberate one. Because Maya was sitting across from him with her worksheet and her pencil and her complete unconditional expectation that he was present, and she deserved the sevens before she deserved to lose him to a screen. 7 times 8, he said. Maya scrunched her face. 54? Try again. 56. There it is. She wrote it down with the satisfaction of someone who'd earned it. Okay, 9 times 7. That one's yours. I'm not giving you the 9s, she groaned. He picked up his phone. He read the email once, standing at the kitchen counter, while Maya muttered multiplication facts under her breath. Then he read it again. Then he set the phone face down on the counter, looked at the ceiling for approximately 3 seconds, and picked it up and read it a third time. The offer was for the second position. The one Victoria had described in the follow-up smaller team, direct strategic access closer orbit. The salary was 30% above what he'd been making at Mercer when he left, which was already above what he'd expected. The title was Senior Strategic Analyst, reporting directly to the CEO's office. The start date was 2 weeks out. And at the bottom of the formal offer language below the signature block and the benefit summary, there was a line that wasn't part of any standard offer letter he'd ever seen. A single sentence typed in the same font as everything else that said, "I trust you'll make the right decision, Mr. Cole. I rarely extend this particular role. Trust that I know what I'm doing." He read that line 4 times. "Dad." Maya was looking at him. "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The thinking really hard face. Your forehead gets all—" She made a scrunching gesture with her hand. He turned the phone over and set it back down. "Finish your 9s. "Did something happen?" "Finish your 9s, Maya." She looked at him for a moment with those eyes that missed nothing, then looked back down at her worksheet. 9 times 6 is 54, she said. "I know that one." "Good. And 9 times 7 is 63. Mom taught me the trick with the fingers." He looked at her. She said it the way she always said things about Claire, not with grief, not performing sadness, just with the natural ease of a child who had found a way to keep her mother present in ordinary moments. Like Claire was still part of the household, still contributing, still teaching sevens and nines through the memory she'd left behind. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She did." Maya finished her worksheet. He made dinner. After he put her to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the offer letter he'd printed out, and he read it one more time, and that last line still sat at the bottom of the page like a small, precisely placed stone. "I trust you'll make the right decision, Mr. Cole." He picked up his pen and wrote 2 words on a notepad. "Call David." Then he thought about it and wrote underneath, "Don't call David." He accepted the offer at 9:15 that evening. Short reply, professional, no excess. He thanked her for the opportunity, confirmed the start date, said he looked forward to contributing to the firm. He stared at the sent message for a moment. Then he closed his laptop and went to bed and did not sleep particularly well. His first day at Lane Enterprises fell on a Monday, as first days tended to do. He was in the building by 7:50, which was 20 minutes before anyone had told him to arrive, because arriving early was the one anxiety behavior he'd never managed to fully dismantle. Diane met him in the lobby, gave him his credentials, and a brief orientation that moved at the pace of someone who considered efficiency a personal value, and walked him to his office. A real office, glass-walled, on the 38th floor, 3 doors down from Victoria's. He stood in it for a moment after Diane left. It was larger than his kitchen. He put his bag down on the desk and looked out through the glass wall at the floor beyond analysts at workstations, the quiet, industrious energy of a team that already knew what it was doing, and he felt the particular specific feeling of being the new person in a room full of people who weren't new. The feeling of being on the outside of a language everyone else already spoke. He'd felt it before. He knew what to do with it. You did the work, you learned the language, you earned your way in. There were no shortcuts, and the absence of shortcuts was something he'd always found clarifying rather than discouraging. He opened his laptop, pulled up the briefing materials Diane had sent him the previous Friday, and started reading. He'd been reading for 40 minutes when the knock came. Not on his door, on the glass wall. One sharp rap, the kind that assumed the person inside would look up immediately. He looked up. Victoria Lane stood on the other side of the glass. Dark blazer, dark slacks, her hair back the way it always was. She was holding a coffee mug in one hand and a thin folder in the other, and she tilted her head toward the door with a look that said she didn't intend to stand in the hallway indefinitely. He stood up, opened the door. "You're early," she said. "It's a habit. Keep it." She walked past him into the office, set the folder on his desk, and turned to face him. "How much of the briefing package have you covered?" "The full equity portfolio overview, the Q3 strategic summary, and about half of the Meridian acquisition analysis." She studied him briefly. "What did you think of the Meridian analysis?" "I think whoever wrote it reached the right conclusion with incomplete modeling. The integration cost assumptions in Section 3 are optimistic by at least 15%, and if those numbers shift, the timeline for margin recovery shifts with them. The conclusion might still hold, but the confidence level attached to it is higher than it should be." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been here 40 minutes, she said. "I read fast." "The analyst who wrote that report has 7 years at this firm." "Then he's good at a lot of things," Ethan said. "The integration assumptions are still optimistic." Something shifted in her expression. Not displeasure, the opposite of displeasure. She pulled the folder off his desk and opened it. "Meridian is what I came to talk to you about. We have a board presentation in 3 weeks. I want a revised analysis on my desk in 10 days, new modeling on the integration costs, sensitivity scenarios, at 3 different confidence intervals, and a risk-adjusted timeline that I can actually defend in a room full of people who will look for the holes." "I can do that." "I know you can. That's why I'm standing in your office at 8:30 on your first day." She closed the folder and handed it back to him. "I'll need updates at the midpoint. Don't wait until day 10 to tell me if something in the numbers is going sideways." I won't. She held his gaze for a moment. And Cole. She used his last name the same way she used everything directly without the performance of familiarity or the stiffness of its absence. Ask questions when you need to. The people on this floor have been here a long time, and they know how this firm works. Use that. I will. She turned to go. Then she stopped and turned back and looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize. The expression that preceded something said with slightly more weight than it would carry from anyone else. How was your weekend? He blinked. The question was so plainly simply human sitting there in the middle of an otherwise entirely professional exchange that it took him a half-second to process the register shift. Good, he said. Maya had a soccer game. They lost, but she scored her first goal of the season, so the overall verdict was positive. Something moved in Victoria's face. Brief and genuine, and then carefully managed back. How old is she? 7. What's her position? Theoretically midfielder. In practice, she goes wherever the ball is and argues with anyone who suggests she shouldn't. Victoria looked at him for a moment. She sounds like someone who's going to be difficult to say no to. She already is. The corner of her mouth moved. More than a suggestion, less than a full smile, and somehow more interesting than either. Good morning, Mr. Cole. Good morning, Miss Lane. She left. He watched the glass door close behind her and stood in the quiet of his new office for a moment, holding the folder, and thinking about the way she'd asked about his weekend. Not as small talk, not filling dead air as a genuine question with the particular attention of someone who actually listened to answers. He sat back down and opened the Meridian file. He had 10 days. He was going to need 8. The work was hard, and he loved it. That was the thing he hadn't let himself fully expect, or maybe hadn't let himself fully hope for, which was different. He'd known intellectually that the position would challenge him. He hadn't been prepared for the specific quality of the challenge, the way it required everything he had. And then, a little more, the way each problem at Lane Enterprises seemed engineered to sit at the exact outer edge of what he could handle. Victoria ran the firm with a standard of rigor that was almost aesthetic in its consistency. Every analysis that crossed her desk was questioned, every assumption surfaced, every conclusion held up against alternative interpretations before it was accepted. She didn't do this to be difficult. She did it because she believed with an apparently unshakable conviction that the only analysis worth having was one that had already survived being attacked by the person who wrote it. It pushed him in a way he hadn't been pushed since his early years at Mercer, before he'd gotten comfortable, before he'd learned to do good enough in his sleep. He didn't want to do good enough anymore. He wasn't sure he ever really had. By day 4, he had the revised integration cost model in preliminary form. By day 6, he had the 3 sensitivity scenarios built and stress tested. On day 7 at 6:45 in the evening, with most of the floor emptied out, he walked 3 doors down and knocked on the open frame of Victoria's office. She was at her desk jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, 2 screens open, and a legal pad covered in handwriting on the desk beside her keyboard. She looked up. "Midpoint update," he said. "Come in." He sat across from her and walked her through where the model stood. She listened without interrupting, which he'd learned was not her default posture. She interrupted when she had a question, which meant the absence of interruption was itself a signal. She let him finish, then picked up his printout and looked at it. "The downside scenario," she said. "Confidence interval is 30%. Yes. That feels wide. It's accurate. The variable it's attached to the retention rate for Meridian's senior technical staff has a genuinely wide range of outcomes depending on how the integration is managed. I could narrow the interval by making assumptions I can't support, but I don't think that serves the presentation." She looked at the page. "The board won't like a 30% confidence interval." "No," he said. "But they'll like it less if they approve the acquisition at 90% confidence and it comes in at 30. Silence. She set the printout down. She looked at him across the desk with an expression that was impossible to read and very focused. Say that again in the room when Hollis pushes back on it. He'll push back. He always does. I'll say it. He's been on this board for 11 years, and he's never met a risk he didn't want to underprice. I've met people like that. He's louder than most of them. She picked up her pen and made 2 marks on the printout. The margin recovery timeline, extend the base case by a quarter. Here. The integration cost shift you identified cascades forward, and I want the timeline to reflect that before I'm standing in front of 12 people and someone does the math in real time. He nodded. I'll have the revised model to you by end of day tomorrow. Tonight. He looked at her. It's almost 7. I'm aware. She held his gaze without apology. You said the cascade effect on the timeline is material. If it's material, I want to see it before I go home tonight. I have a call with our legal team at 7:30, and I'd like to go into it with accurate numbers. He thought about Mrs. Patterson. He thought about the dinner he'd told Maya he'd be home for. He thought about the conversation he'd had with himself 2 weeks ago about the difference between the job being demanding and the job being worth it. I need to make a call first, he said. She studied him. Something in her expression calibrated, not impatience, something more careful than impatience. Your daughter. Yes. A beat. Make your call. She turned back to her screens. You have 15 minutes. The model can wait 15 minutes. He stepped out into the hallway and called Mrs. Patterson, who said of course not a problem, she'd already put lasagna on. And he could hear Maya in the background saying, Is that Dad? Tell him I scored at practice. And he smiled in the empty hallway of Lane Enterprises' 38th floor, alone with Chicago spread out beyond the glass. He went back in. She's fine, he said. I've got time. Victoria looked up from her screen. She looked at him for a moment, not at his face exactly, at something in the general vicinity of how he was carrying himself. And then she said quietly, Good. Just that. One word, but it landed the way she seemed to intend things to land, directly, without unnecessary weight, but without pretending there was no weight at all. He sat back down and opened his laptop. They worked in the same room for the next 2 hours, mostly in silence, occasionally talking through a number or a structural question, and there was something in the quality of that silence that Ethan noticed and filed away without examining too closely. It was comfortable, not the comfort of familiarity he'd known this woman for less than 3 weeks, but the comfort of 2 people who were good at the same things working in proximity, not needing to perform anything for the other person's benefit. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sat in a room with someone and felt that. At 8:52, he sent her the revised model from across the desk. She opened it, read it, made 2 small marks on her legal pad, looked up. This is good work, she said. Thank you. I don't say that to be encouraging. I say it when it's accurate. She closed the file. Go home, Cole. Your daughter has lasagna. He packed his bag. She was already back on her screens. He was at the door when she spoke again without looking up. The soccer goal, she said. From her game this weekend. He paused. What about it? Did she celebrate, or is she the kind who just keeps going? He thought about it, about Maya jogging back to the center circle after the ball hit the net, shoulders back, small fist briefly closed, not jumping, not screaming, just this contained private satisfaction, like she'd expected it all along. Both, he said. She did both at the same time somehow. Victoria's pen stopped moving on the legal pad, just for a half second. Then she made the mark she'd been about to make and said, She sounds like someone worth getting home to. She is, he said. Good night, Ms. Lane. Good night. He walked down the corridor past the darkened workstations to the elevator. He rode it down 40 floors, crossed the marble lobby, pushed through the revolving door. The cold took him same as always Chicago in November, with nothing in its way. He walked to his car. He sat in it for a moment in the parking garage, both hands on the steering wheel engine, not yet running. He was thinking about a woman 3 doors down from his office who had just asked him at nearly 9 in the evening whether his 7-year-old daughter celebrated or kept going after scoring a goal. Who remembered the goal from a story he'd told in passing 6 hours ago for 30 seconds? Who had sat across a desk from him for 2 hours and asked for nothing except good work and given him nothing except the same in return? And somehow that had felt like more than a lot of things that were supposed to feel like more. He started the car. He drove home. Maya was still up technically past her bedtime, sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Patterson, while the lasagna kept warm in the oven, and when he walked in, she launched off the stool and covered the distance between them in approximately 1 second and hit him somewhere in the midsection with the full force of a 7-year-old who'd been waiting. He caught her, held her. "I scored at practice too," she said into his chest. "Mrs. Patterson told me." "Did she tell you it was from really far away?" "She mentioned that." "It was really, really far." "I believe you." She pulled back and looked up at him with her mother's eyes and her own complete, uncomplicated certainty. "You were late because of work." "I was." "Was it good work?" He looked at his daughter. He thought about the office 3 doors down and the legal pad with the handwriting on it, and 2 words that had landed at the end of an otherwise professional conversation, with a precision that suggested they had been chosen rather than defaulted to. "She sounds like someone worth getting home to." "Yeah," he said. "It was good work." The board presentation was on a Thursday. Ethan had the final model delivered to Victoria by Tuesday evening. Revised once based on her notes, revised again, based on his own overnight review of the sensitivity scenarios, and delivered in its final form Wednesday morning at 7:45 a.m., which was 15 minutes before she arrived. Which meant it was sitting on her desk when she walked in, which he'd timed deliberately and then immediately told himself he hadn't. She sent him 2 words by email at 8:03. Good. Ready. He was ready. The boardroom was on the 40th floor. 12 people around a long table. The particular concentrated energy of people who ran large amounts of other people's money and considered every minute of every meeting a resource being spent. Ethan had been in rooms like this before. Not this room, not this firm, but the atmosphere was a language he spoke. He sat 1 chair to Victoria's left. She'd placed him there herself when they walked in a small gesture of positioning that was also a statement not just to him, but to everyone at the table. He's with me. His analysis is mine. The presentation ran 40 minutes. Victoria led it. She moved through the acquisition case with a clarity and authority that Ethan had come to understand in 3 weeks at the firm was genuinely rare. Not performed confidence, but the real thing grounded in having done the work and knowing it completely. And then she got to the integration costs. The revised modeling shows integration costs running approximately 15% above the original assumptions, she said. That's not a reason to walk away from the acquisition. It is a reason to reprice our confidence in the margin recovery timeline. Hollis leaned forward. He was a broad man in his 60s, with the practiced impatience of someone who had made his career out of making other people feel that their caution was cowardice. 15% is a significant revision, Victoria. I'd like to understand the basis for that number before we proceed. Ethan. Victoria turned to him. Not a question, a handoff. He took it. The original model used an industry average retention rate for senior technical staff during integration, he said. 92%. That number is accurate for same-sector acquisitions. Meridian is a cross-sector integration. Their technical personnel have a meaningfully different risk profile for attrition during ownership transitions, and the historical data on comparable cross-sector deals puts the realistic retention range between 78 and 88%. He paused. If we model at the midpoint of that range, the integration cost delta is 14 to 16%. I used 15 as the base case. Hollis looked at him. And what's your confidence interval on that? 30% on the downside scenario. The silence around the table was brief and pointed. "That's a wide interval," Hollis said. "Yes," Ethan said, "because the variable it's attached to has a genuinely wide range of outcomes. I could narrow the interval by making assumptions I can't support. I don't think that serves this board." Hollis looked at Victoria. "Victoria." "He's right, Richard," she said, without inflection, without apology, just the flat, settled certainty of someone who had already weighed the options and arrived. "The interval is wide because the uncertainty is real. If we approve this acquisition at 90% confidence and it comes in at 30, that's not an analytical failure. That's a failure of honesty at this table." The room was quiet. Hollis leaned back. He looked at Ethan with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite its opposite, something in between the preliminary assessment of a man deciding whether another man was worth his attention. "You've been at this firm how long?" 3 weeks. "And you're telling a room full of people who've been in this industry for a combined," he looked around the table, "probably 400 years that our original model was wrong." "I'm telling you, the integration cost assumptions were optimistic," Ethan said. "The conclusion may still hold. The confidence level attached to it was higher than the data supports. Those are different things." Another silence, longer this time. Then the woman to Hollis's left, small, silver-haired, the kind of quiet that had weight in it, said, "I want to see the cross-sector retention data, the historical comparables." "I have them," Ethan said. "Send them to me today. You'll have them within the hour." She looked at Victoria. "I like him." "I know," Victoria said. The presentation concluded without the vote being called. 2 board members wanted additional time with the data which Victoria had anticipated, and told Ethan she'd anticipated, and which meant the acquisition timeline shifted by approximately 3 weeks. Hollis shook Ethan's hand on the way out. Firm grip. Brief eye contact, the handshake of a man who hadn't changed his mind but had updated his data. Victoria walked out last. She passed Ethan in the doorway and said without breaking stride, "My office, 10 minutes." He gave her 11 because the email to Margaret Chu with the historical comparables took 9. She was at the window when he walked in. Same posture as that second interview, arms loosely crossed looking at the city. She turned when she heard him. "Hollis pushed back," she said. "You told me he would. I wanted to see how you handled it." He studied her. "You already knew how I'd handle it. Knowing and seeing are different things." She moved away from the window and sat down. Not the sitting area this time, her desk, which felt like a different register, a different kind of conversation. "The board will approve the acquisition. Margaret's support shifts the vote. She's the one who matters." "I figured." "How?" She was the only person in the room who asked a follow-up question instead of making a statement. People who ask questions are the ones actually deciding. Victoria looked at him for a moment. "Sit down, Cole." He sat in the chair across from her desk. "You did well today," she said. "You said you don't offer encouragement." "I don't. I'm offering an assessment." A pause. "There's a difference." He held her gaze. "I know." She picked up her pen, set it down, picked it up again, a small, uncharacteristic restlessness that he noticed because everything else about her was so deliberate. "I want to move you on to the Caldwell analysis next. It's a different kind of problem, distressed asset complex liability structure, the kind of thing where the numbers tell you one thing and the situation on the ground tells you something else entirely. I'd like your read on where the gap is." "When do you need it?" 2 weeks, but I want to talk through the framing with you first." She paused. "Are you free for lunch today?" The question landed differently than the work questions. Not dramatically, just differently. There was a half-second of recalibration, and then he managed professionally. "Yes. There's a place 2 blocks east. Good food, quiet enough to talk. 12:30. I'll be there." She nodded and looked back at her screen, which was the signal that the meeting was over. He stood up and was almost to the door when she said his name. "Cole." He turned. The thing you said to Hollis. She was looking at the screen, not at him, but the pen had stopped moving. About honesty at the table. A brief pause. That's why you're in this office. He stood in the doorway. I know, he said. He left, and he made it most of the way down the corridor before he allowed himself to exhale fully. Lunch was what she'd said it would be, good food quiet enough to talk. A corner table in a restaurant that understood the value of space between tables and didn't feel the need to fill every silence with background music. Victoria ordered quickly without looking at the menu, long the way people ordered when eating was a function rather than an event. He did the same. They talked about Caldwell for the first 20 minutes. She laid out the structural problem with the precision of someone who had already thought it through completely and was using conversation to test her own conclusions rather than reach them. He pushed back twice, once on her read of the liability structure, once on which counterparty held the real leverage in any restructuring scenario. Both times she listened, fully argued back. The first time, conceded the second, with a nod that was brief and completely without drama. Then they finished eating, and she pushed her plate slightly to the side and looked at him, and the conversation shifted. How are you finding it? She asked. The firm, the work. Honestly, always. It's the hardest I've worked in years, he said. I mean that as a compliment. I know how you mean it. She held her coffee mug in both hands. And outside the work. He paused. What about it? The adjustment. New schedule, new hours a 7-year-old to get home to. She wasn't asking out of routine courtesy. She was asking because she wanted to know, and they'd been working together long enough now that the difference was legible. It's not a small thing. Most people underestimate what it costs in the first month. Mrs. Patterson helps, he said. And Maya adapts. She always has. He paused. She actually asked me last week what my boss's name was. I told her Victoria. She thought about it for a second and said, That sounds like someone serious. Victoria looked at him. Something happened around her eyes. She's not wrong. I told her you were serious but fair. She said, like a teacher. What did you say? I said more like a head coach. The corner of Victoria's mouth moved, and this time it went further than it usually did. Crossed the line from restrained to actual, a brief, real smile that changed her face completely and was gone in under 2 seconds, but had been there unmistakably. I've been called worse, she said. I told her the important thing was that my boss was good at her job. He paused. She asked if my boss was nice. I said you were fair, which was better than nice. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee, then she looked at him. You told your daughter I was fair. It's what I think. Not nice. Nice is a low bar. He held her gaze. Fair is harder to be. You're fair. She held the look for a moment. Not long enough to be uncomfortable. Long enough to mean something. Then she set her mug down and said, Tell me about Claire. The name hit him the way it sometimes did, not with the full force grief of the early months, but with the particular resonance of something that still mattered completely, that would always matter completely. Why? He asked. Because she's present in every conversation we've had, Victoria said. Not as a subject you haven't brought her up. But she's there. In the tie you wore on the first day. In the way you talk about Maya. She paused. In the way you talk about fair being better than nice. He was quiet for a moment. She was a teacher, he said. 4th grade. 29 kids in her class, and she knew everything about every one of them, their home situations, what they ate for breakfast, who their friends were, what scared them. She was the kind of person who made other people feel like they mattered on a regular basis, and never seemed to find it effortful. He stopped. She died 3.5 years ago. Blood clot. 40 minutes between when she felt something was wrong and when she was gone. Victoria didn't fill the silence. She let it be what it was. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Just that. No elaboration, no reaching, no attempt to make it smaller or more manageable than it was. "Thank you." She sounds like someone who deserved more time. She did. He looked at the table for a moment, then back up. Maya is her. Not just the eyes, the way she thinks, the way she pays attention to people, the way she says things straight without meaning to be blunt. She got all the best parts. Victoria was watching him with the particular stillness of someone who was being careful with something. "I haven't talked about her much," he said, "in a professional context." "You're not in a professional context right now," Victoria said. "We're at lunch." He smiled, small but real. "Is there a meaningful difference when you're my boss?" "I hope so, Mom." She said it without irony, without hedging, with the same directness she applied to everything. And then she shifted almost imperceptibly in her chair. "Can I tell you something?" "Yes." She looked at her hands around the mug, then at him. "I almost didn't call you in for the follow-up." He waited. Not because the Hartwell analysis wasn't impressive. It was. And not because the first interview didn't go well. It went better than any interview I've run in the last 2 years. She paused. "I almost didn't call because of the opposite reason. Because it went too well. And because by the time you left, I was already thinking about you more than I should have been for someone I'd spent 90 minutes with. And I have rules about that." The table was very quiet. "I've had rules about that for a long time," she continued. "They're sensible rules. The kind you make because you learned the hard way why they need to exist. I have a firm to run, and I can't afford—" She paused, measuring. "I can't afford complications." "But you called," he said. "But I called." She held his gaze. "Because I told myself it was professional. The second position, the strategic access, the specific skill set, all true, all real. None of it false." A beat. "Also, not the whole truth." The whole restaurant seemed to have gone slightly quieter. Or maybe that was just the particular quality of attention he was paying. "Victoria." He said her name for the first time. Not Ms. Lane. Her name. "What are you telling me?" She looked at him directly, the way she looked at everything, without flinching, without softening it into something easier. "I'm telling you that I'm aware of something. That I've been aware of it since you were standing in my hallway with a crooked tie, looking like a man who'd been carrying the world for so long he'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to feel that heavy." She paused. "And I'm telling you because you're someone who told a boardroom full of powerful people that honesty at the table was non-negotiable. I believe in practicing what I require of other people." He sat with that for a moment. "I have rules too," he said. "I know you do. Some of mine are about the job. Some of them are about—" He stopped, found the words. "About the fact that I spent 2 years putting myself back together, and I don't know what I'm ready for. I'm not asking you to be ready for anything." She said it quickly, clearly, without defensiveness. "I'm not saying what this is or what it should be. I'm telling you what I've noticed. That's all." He looked at her, at the composed, certain, carefully constructed woman across the table from him, who had just said with complete precision exactly as much as she'd meant to say, and not one word more. "The thing you said," he said, "in the interview, the first one." She waited. "About my lips." Something moved in her face. Slight. Controlled. "Yes." "Was it a test?" She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "Which answer do you want?" He felt that in his chest. "The honest one." "It was both," she said. "I wanted to see how you handled pressure and disruption. That was real." A pause. "And I meant it." Another pause, shorter. "That was also real." He breathed slowly. "So what do we do?" he said. with a thing that's real and also complicated, and also sitting in the middle of a professional relationship that matters to both of us. Victoria looked at him. She was doing the thing she did when she was genuinely thinking, not performing. Thought actually doing it, and the difference on her face was subtle but legible to him now, after 3 weeks of sitting across tables from her. "I don't know," she said. He stared at her. "You don't know." "I'm aware that's not the answer you expected from me." "It's really not." "I'm also aware," she said, "that I don't know is the most honest answer I have. And given the conversation we just had about honesty at tables, I thought you'd prefer it." He laughed. It came out before he could stop it, short, genuine surprise out of him. It was the first time he'd laughed in her presence, and the sound of it seemed to catch her slightly off guard, and she looked at him with something new and unguarded in her expression, something she didn't immediately manage back into composure, something warmer than composure. "Okay," he said, when the laugh had settled. "We don't know." "We don't know," she agreed. "And we go back to the office." "And we go back to the office," she said. "And we do the work. Because the work is real too, and it matters, and neither of us is someone who lets what they don't know become an excuse for not doing what they do know." He looked at her for a long moment. At the steady, complicated, rigorously honest woman across the table who had just in the space of one lunch told him more true things than most people managed in a year. "Fair," he said. She looked at him. "You said fair is harder to be." The corner of her mouth moved. "You're fair too, Cole." He picked up the check before she could reach for it. She gave him a look. He held it without apology. "I'm not doing it because you're my boss," he said. "I'm doing it because you just told me the truth when you didn't have to. That deserves something." She held the look for one more second. Then she let him take the check. They walked back to the office side by side through the November cold, not talking, not filling the space with words that weren't needed. The silence between them was the same kind it had been in the office that late evening, comfortable in a way that had no business being that comfortable this quickly between two people carrying the kinds of things they were each carrying. He held the lobby door for her. She walked through. Their eyes met briefly in the reflection of the glass as the door swung closed, and neither of them looked away immediately. In the elevator, she stood on one side, he stood on the other, and the 38th floor button was already lit. "Cole," she said when the doors were almost open. "Yeah." "The Caldwell framing conversation. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I'll be there at 7:50. "I know you will." The doors opened. She stepped out first. "That's one of the things." He stepped out behind her. "One of what things?" She was already walking down the corridor, and she didn't turn back when she said it, just said it forward into the clean quiet of the 38th floor hallway. "One of the things I've noticed." She turned into her office. The glass door swung shut behind her. Ethan stood in the corridor for a moment alone. Then he walked 3 doors down to his own office, sat at his desk, and opened the Caldwell file. His mind was running on 2 tracks simultaneously, the liability structure on the screen in front of him, and the echo of a voice saying, "I don't know," with more honesty in it than most certainties he'd ever been handed. He pulled up his notes. He started working. Outside his glass wall, 38 floors above Michigan Avenue, Chicago, went about its business, indifferent and enormous, and completely unaware that something small and significant and not yet named had shifted quietly into place in the middle of an ordinary Thursday afternoon. The Caldwell analysis took 11 days. Not because the work was slow, Ethan ran hard on it the same way he'd run on Meridian, the same way he'd run on everything since his first morning in that glass-walled office. It took 11 days because the liability structure was genuinely complicated, the kind of problem that kept revealing new layers the deeper you pressed into it. And because Victoria's standard for what constituted a finished analysis was considerably higher than anyone else's definition of finished. They met every morning at 8. Sometimes in her office, sometimes in the small conference room at the end of the hall, once standing at his whiteboard for 40 minutes, while he walked her through a restructuring scenario, and she asked questions that improved his thinking in real time and showed no particular interest in whether he knew that or not. The work was serious, and the hours were long, and the standard never dropped, and he was grateful for all three. What he was less certain about was everything that existed underneath the work. Because it was there. It had been there since lunch, since she'd said "I don't know" with more honesty in it than he'd known how to handle, and it hadn't diminished in 11 days of professional rigor. If anything, working this closely with her had made it more present, not less. Every conversation that cracked slightly open, every moment of her unguarded, that she allowed him to see every late evening when the floor emptied, and it was just the two of them and the city outside, and the comfortable silence that had no business being as comfortable as it was. He hadn't done anything about it. Neither had she. They had an unspoken agreement, apparently, to hold what had been said at that lunch table in a place where it could exist without being acted on or denied. And most days, he thought that was the right call. The sensible call. The call that two adults with complicated lives and something real to protect should make. Most days. On the 11th day, he sent her the final Caldwell analysis at 6:15 in the morning before she arrived, and by 7:58 she'd sent back 2 words. Perfect. Come in. He walked into her office at 8 exactly. She was at her desk, with the analysis open on her screen, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Sit down." And he sat, and she said, "The liability waterfall in Section 4. Walk me through your thinking on the second lien position." He walked her through it. She listened, made 2 marks on her legal pad, asked 1 follow-up question, and when he answered it, she closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "The board will see this Friday," she said. "I'm presenting it myself. I want you in the room." "I'll be there." Hollis has already been briefed. He has concerns about the debt-to-equity assumption in the base case. His concerns are wrong. "I know they are." A pause. "I wanted you to hear that I know." He looked at her. "You don't have to tell me that." "No," she agreed. "I don't." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm telling you because last week you told me that fair was harder to be than nice, and you still chose it. I'm trying to practice that." The office was quiet. Outside the glass wall, the floor was filling up the ordinary morning machinery of the firm running its course. In here it felt separate from all of that. "Victoria." He said her name the way he'd started to say it, not often, not casually, but deliberately, when what he was about to say required it. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." The line at the bottom of the offer letter. The last sentence. She didn't look away. "What about it?" "I trust you'll make the right decision. I rarely extend this particular role. Trust that I know what I'm doing." He paused. "What did you mean?" She was quiet for a moment. The pen in her hand was still. "I meant what it said," she told him. "That the role was specific, that I'd thought carefully about who should be in it." A pause. "And that I knew what I was doing when I offered it to a man who'd been carrying grief for 3 years and still walked into an interview and told me the truth when he could have told me something easier." He sat with that. "That's a lot of information to put in an offer letter," he said. It was 1 sentence. It was a loaded sentence. "Most important sentences are." She set the pen down. "You knew what it meant when you read it." "I did," he admitted. "And you accepted anyway." "I did." She looked at him with the direct, unflinching attention that he'd come to understand was simply how she looked at things she considered important. Why? He thought about how to answer that honestly. The honest answer had several layers, and he was aware of all of them and aware of which ones were appropriate to say in this office at 8 in the morning and which ones were not. He chose the one that was both true and clean. "Because the work was real," he said. "And because I believed you when you said you knew what you were doing." A pause. "Both things." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once and said, "Caldwell presentation is at 2 on Friday." I'll need you at 1:15 for a pre-brief. She looked back at her screen. That's all. He stood up. He was at the door when she spoke again. Ethan. He turned. She'd used his first name exactly twice in the weeks he'd been here. Both times it had landed differently than everything else. Are you free Saturday? She said. He stood very still. Define free. I have a charity event. Annual thing, the firm sponsors it, I'm expected to attend. It runs from 6 to 9 and I find them... A slight pause. Easier with someone I can talk to. She looked at him with an expression that was composed and careful and only slightly armored. It's not an order. You can say no. He looked at her for a moment. I'll need to arrange someone for Maya, he said. Of course. Mrs. Patterson usually helps with that. Of course, she said again. Still waiting. Still holding the composed expression with the slight armor. Then, yes, he said. I'm free Saturday. Something happened in her face. Brief. Real. Managed quickly back to composure, but not quickly enough that he didn't see it. 6 o'clock, she said. I'll send the details. He nodded. He walked out. He made it to his own office, sat down at his desk, looked at the Caldwell file still open on his screen, and did not immediately start working because he needed 60 full seconds to simply sit with the fact that Victoria Lane had just asked him to go somewhere with her on a Saturday evening and had said it wasn't an order and that he could say no. He thought about the crooked tie. He thought about the hallway and her hands at his collar, and 12 words that had been the beginning of something he still couldn't name completely, but had stopped trying to name and started simply being present for. He opened the Caldwell file. He started working. Friday's board presentation ran clean. Hollis raised his concern about the debt-to-equity assumption in the first 10 minutes, precisely as anticipated. Ethan answered it with the same quiet directness he'd used on the integration costs 4 weeks earlier. Not combative, not deferential. Just accurate, just the numbers and the logic and the honest account of what they meant. Hollis held his ground for approximately 2 exchanges and then stopped holding it. Which was, Ethan was learning how most things went when you had the right numbers and the patience to let them do their work. Margaret Chu looked at him from across the table afterward and said, You're settling in. Trying, he said. Don't try too hard, she said. The thing that makes you useful in these rooms is that you haven't been here long enough to know which fights aren't worth having. Give it a year before you start learning that. He smiled. I'll take the advice. She patted the folder in front of her. Good analysis. She glanced at Victoria and then back at him. She doesn't often get it right this fast. Get what right? He asked. Margaret smiled in the way of someone who had been in a great many rooms for a very long time. The higher, she said simply. She left. Victoria was talking to 2 other board members near the window. She didn't look over at him, but there was a slight shift in her posture, the faint peripheral awareness of someone who knew where a person was in a room without looking at them directly. He gathered his folders and walked out. Saturday came cold and clear. He arranged Maya with Mrs. Patterson, who asked no questions, but gave him a look that covered most of the questions, and he put on the dark suit, not the charcoal one from the interview. A better one, the one he'd bought 2 years ago for his brother's second wedding and had worn twice since, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror tying his tie. Not Claire's tie, his own. He made the knot on the second try. Straight-centered, settled. He looked at himself for a moment at the man in the mirror who was 41 years old and going somewhere on a Saturday evening that was not entirely professional and was not entirely otherwise, and he waited for the guilt to arrive the way it sometimes did. The involuntary referendum from somewhere inside him that asked whether this was allowed, whether wanting something for himself again was a betrayal of everything that had been lost. It didn't come. What came instead was the memory of Maya at the kitchen table 2 mornings ago, eating her cereal with the cartoon dog bowl, asking him why he was wearing his good suit to work on Friday, and when he'd explained the board presentation, she'd said very seriously, Dad, you should smile more when you talk about your job. You look happy when you talk about your job. You should let people see that. 7 years old. He straightened his tie and went to pick up Victoria Lane. She was waiting outside her building when he arrived. Dark coat, dark dress underneath it. Her hair down. The first time he'd seen it down, and it was different, softer. And she looked like herself, and also like a version of herself that existed outside the 38th floor, which was its own particular adjustment. She got into the car and said, "Thank you for driving." And he said, "Of course." And they pulled into traffic, and for the first 2 blocks, neither of them said anything. And the silence was comfortable in the way their silences had become comfortable, which was something he'd stopped questioning and started simply accepting. "How's Maya?" she asked. "She told me this morning that she wants to be either a soccer player or a judge. She hasn't decided which." "Why a judge?" "She had a dispute with a kid at school about whose turn it was on the swings, and she said the resolution process was unfair. She thinks someone should be in charge of making sure things are decided properly." Victoria looked straight ahead through the windshield. "I like her," she said. "You've never met her." "I like her anyway." He glanced over. She was looking out the side window now, a slight smile on her face that she wasn't bothering to manage back, and he looked at the road and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would improve on the moment. The event was what it was. Large room, well-dressed people. The particular performance of a corporate charity function that everyone understood was part of a larger social contract and engaged with accordingly. Victoria worked the room with the efficiency of someone who'd attended 100 of these and had developed a system for them. She introduced him to people, and the introductions were professional, but not purely professional. She said his name with a slight emphasis, a fractional ownership that was legible if you were paying attention. He paid attention. Around 8 o'clock, they found themselves standing at the edge of the room with drinks they were barely touching, and she said, "I owe you a confession." He looked at her. "About what?" "This event." She looked around the room. "I've been attending this particular function for 6 years. For the last 4 of them, I've brought Diane as my +1 because Diane is efficient and unambiguous and doesn't complicate anything." He was quiet for a moment. "And this year, you brought me. And this year I brought you. Knowing it was more complicated. Knowing it was more complicated." She looked at him. "I told you I had rules. I didn't tell you that I've been revising them for the last 5 weeks one at a time, and I'm still not entirely sure what I'm doing, which is an unusual experience for me." He turned to face her more fully. "What does the revision look like so far?" "It looks like admitting that the rules were written to protect me from a situation I had fairly low expectations of encountering." She paused. "And that the situation I encountered doesn't fit the original parameters." He thought about a bathroom wall and a shaking hand and a crooked tie. He thought about an elevator going up 41 seconds. He thought about 11 weeks of the hardest, most honest, most alive he'd felt in 3 years. "Victoria," he said. "Yes. I'm going to say something. You can tell me it's too fast or too complicated, or that it jeopardizes something that matters to both of us. All of those things are true, and I'll hear any of them." She was watching him with total attention. "I don't want to go back to before I knew you," he said. "Not the job. I know what the job is. I mean you specifically. The way you think and the way you tell the truth and the way you asked me once whether my daughter celebrated or kept going and remembered the answer and thought it mattered." He stopped. "I've been closed for 3 years. Deliberately, necessarily closed. And I'm aware that somewhere in the last 11 weeks, something opened. I'm not asking you to know what to do with that. I'm just not willing to pretend it isn't true." The room moved around them, oblivious. Somewhere across it, someone laughed at something, and the sound floated past and disappeared. Victoria looked at him for a long moment with the expression she had when she was thinking, not performing thought, actually doing it, and then she said quietly, "When I fixed your tie. In the hallway the first day. You froze. I know. Not because you were uncomfortable. a statement, not a question. "No," he said. "Not because of that." "I know why you froze," she said. "Because I knew the moment it happened, and I fixed your tie anyway, which tells you something about the state of my rules even then." She paused. "Before the interview started, before I knew anything about the Hartwell analysis, or how you handled pressure, or the fact that you'd push back on me in a boardroom without flinching." She held his gaze. The rules were already losing. He breathed slowly. "So what do we do?" he said. The same question he'd asked at the lunch table 5 weeks ago. "I still don't know exactly," she said. "I know we do it carefully. I know we do it honestly. I know we don't let it compromise the work because the work matters to both of us, and we'd both resent it if it did." A pause. "And I know that I'm done pretending I brought you here tonight because Diane wasn't available." He looked at her. "I'm done pretending that too," he said. She looked back at him, and this time she didn't manage the warmth back into composure. She let it stay fully on her face, and it was different from every other version of her he'd seen. Not softer exactly, but more complete, like the professional certainty and the human warmth had finally decided to occupy the same space. "Take me home after this," she said, "and come in for coffee. And let's be two people who talk without an agenda, without the office between us, and see what that is." "Yes," he said. "That's all I'm asking for tonight." "I know." He paused. "It's enough." She picked up her drink and turned back toward the room, and he stood beside her, and the rest of the evening passed the way evenings pass when something has been decided, and both people know it lighter, different with the particular quality of air that follows an exhale held too long. He dropped Maya at school on Monday morning, 9 weeks later, and Maya said from the back seat as she was unbuckling her seatbelt, "Dad." "Yeah." "Is Victoria coming to my soccer game on Saturday?" He looked in the rearview mirror. "Where did that come from?" "You said she asked about my games." Maya said it with the air of someone presenting a logical sequence. "And you said she thinks what I said about being a judge was good. And she texted you last night and you smiled at your phone, which is new." He turned around to face her. "I smile at my phone." "Not like that, you don't." She looked at him with Claire's eyes and her own complete unhurried certainty. "I think she should come to my game." "That's Maya, that's—" "I can score a goal for her," she offered. From far away. He sat in the drop-off lane of Carver Elementary School engine, running staring at his daughter. "I'll ask her," he finally said. Maya nodded satisfied, as if this had been the correct and obvious answer all along. She shouldered her backpack, pushed open the door, and then turned back one more time, with her hand on the doorframe. "Dad," she said. "What?" "The smiling at your phone thing." She looked at him steadily. "Mom would like it, just so you know." She shut the door and ran toward the entrance, backpack bouncing small and certain, and entirely her mother's daughter. And Ethan sat in his car in the drop-off lane until the car behind him tapped its horn gently. He pulled out into the street. He drove toward Michigan Avenue, toward the glass tower, toward the 38th floor and the office 3 doors down, and the work that was real, and the woman who had told him the truth when she didn't have to, and kept telling it every day since. His phone was in the cup holder. He waited until a red light, then picked it up, and typed one message to Victoria. "Maya wants to know if you're coming to her game Saturday. She says she'll score a goal for you." From far away. The light turned green. He put the phone down and drove. It buzzed before he reached the next block. He waited until he parked in the garage. Then he picked it up and read it. Victoria's reply was 3 words. 3 words that were exactly as direct and exactly as certain and exactly as completely herself as everything else she had ever said to him. "I'll be there." He looked at those 3 words for a moment. Then he got out of the car, walked into the lobby, rode the elevator 40 floors, and stepped out onto the 38th floor with the early light coming through the windows and the day already in motion around him. He had work to do. Good work, real work, the kind that mattered, and asked everything of him, and gave it back doubled. He had a daughter who scored goals from far away and delivered truth at drop-off with no particular warning. He had a woman 3 doors down who had reached for a crooked tie in a hallway one November morning and started something that neither of them had a clean name for yet, but both of them had stopped pretending wasn't there. Ethan Cole walked into his office, set his bag down, sat at his desk, and opened his laptop. Outside the glass, Chicago was enormous and indifferent, and completely unaware that a man who had slammed his fist against a bathroom wall 11 weeks ago and whispered, "Just let me get through today," was sitting at a desk on the 38th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, and the day ahead of him was not something to survive. It was something to live. He started working.